I'm a police officer in a coastal area, and there's a rule here that sounds simple enough, but almost no one outside this town takes it seriously. If someone ignores it, the consequences are always bad. After dark, going anywhere near the lighthouse isn't just discouraged, it's considered dangerous. Coastal towns look peaceful during the day. The ocean feels calm, the air is cool, and the lighthouse stands quietly in the distance, but at night, everything changes. I've worked as a police officer in this area for several years, and from the very first day on the job, we were given a few rules to follow. No explanations, no exceptions, and the most important rule of all was simple. After dark, stay away from the lighthouse. When I first started working in this coastal town, the lighthouse didn't seem unusual at all. During the day, tourists stopped to take photos, locals walked past it without a second thought, and fishermen used it as nothing more than a landmark. It looked old but harmless, just another structure watching over the sea. That impression changed quickly once I learned how people behaved around it after sunset. A senior officer pulled me aside during my first week and explained the rules of the area. Most of them were routine, but when he mentioned the lighthouse, his tone changed. He said, "We do not patrol near it at night. We do not respond to calls from that area after dark, and we do not approach it for any reason." I asked why. He didn't give me a story or a warning filled with drama. He just said the rule wasn't created because of one incident. It was built over time, after years of mistakes. His voice wasn't scared, it was tired, like someone who had already learned the lesson the hard way. At first, I assumed the rule existed because of safety concerns. Strong winds, slippery rocks, an unstable structure. That explanation made sense to me. But over time, I noticed something else. The locals followed the rule too. Fishermen always returned before sunset. Walkers turned back long before it got dark. Even people who lived nearby avoided looking in that direction once night fell. It wasn't fear exactly, it was more like quiet agreement. One night during patrol, a message came over the radio. Someone had reported an unusual light near the lighthouse. Not the normal rotating beam, something inconsistent, flickering, stopping, starting again. According to protocol, I was supposed to log the call and move on, and that's exactly what I did. But as I drove along the coast, I slowed down without realizing it. From a distance, I could see the lighthouse clearly against the dark sky. The light wasn't behaving normally. Instead of its steady rotation, it paused. Then it moved again. Then it stopped completely, as if someone inside was controlling it by hand. That sight alone was enough to make my stomach tighten. I didn't turn toward it. I didn't get closer. I kept driving. That night was the first time I truly understood that the rule wasn't about accidents or old buildings. It was about something else entirely. Something that didn't want attention and didn't react well when it got it. After that night, I kept telling myself I had done the right thing. I hadn't gone near the lighthouse. I hadn't broken the rule, and maybe that was why I was still standing there, still wearing my badge, still able to convince myself that everything was under control. Life in the coastal town continued as usual for a few days. Patrols were quiet, calls were routine, and the lighthouse stayed dark after sunset. But in places like this, silence never lasts forever. It just waits. A few nights later, close to midnight, my radio crackled again. This time, the voice on the other end didn't sound panicked. It sounded confused, like someone trying to describe something they didn't fully understand. The caller was a local who lived near the shoreline. He said he'd seen movement near the lighthouse, someone walking slowly along the base, stopping, then moving again. I asked if he could tell who it was. After a pause, he said no. He couldn't explain why, but the figure didn't look right. Protocol was clear. Calls like that were logged, not investigated. I followed procedure and marked it down, telling myself that curiosity was exactly how officers got into trouble in this town. But only minutes later, the radio came to life again. This time it wasn't a civilian, it was a new officer, a deputy who had joined the force just weeks earlier. He said he was already patrolling along the coast and had noticed something unusual near the lighthouse. He asked if he had permission to get closer. The moment he said that, my stomach tightened. I told him no. I didn't raise my voice, but I was firm. I ordered him to turn around and leave the area immediately. There was a short pause before he responded, and when he did, his tone had changed. He said he was already pretty close, not at the door, just close enough to see that the light wasn't behaving normally. I repeated the order, more urgently this time, telling him to leave right now. The radio went quiet. No response, just the low hiss of static mixed with the distant sound of waves. Then his voice came back, softer, slower. like he wasn't really talking to me anymore. He said the light was moving on its own, not rotating, not steady, like someone was stopping it and starting it again. After that, the radio went dead. I contacted my senior officer immediately. Within minutes, we had multiple vehicles heading toward the shoreline, but none of us crossed the boundary. We stayed back, exactly where the rules said we should. From a distance, the lighthouse stood completely dark, no movement, no sound, just a tall silhouette against the night sky, like it had never done anything wrong. The next morning, the deputy walked into the station on his own. He was alive, but something about him was different. He couldn't explain what happened after he reached the lighthouse door. He said his memory just stopped. The only thing he remembered clearly was a voice from inside, calm and certain, telling him that he wasn't supposed to be there. He resigned later that day. After that incident, the rule was updated. It was written more clearly than before, in plain language, with no room for interpretation. After dark, there are no exceptions. After the deputy resigned, things didn't go back to normal. On the surface, everything looked the same. Patrol schedules stayed the same. Reports were filed the same way. The lighthouse remained off limits after dark, just like it always had been. But the feeling in the town had shifted. People spoke even less than before, and when they did, they avoided certain subjects without needing to be reminded. It was as if everyone quietly understood that something had been stirred, and now it needed time to settle again. A week later, I was assigned to night patrol along the outer edge of the coastal road, far enough from the lighthouse to stay within protocol but close enough to keep an eye on the shoreline. The weather was calm, and the sea looked almost flat, which made the silence feel heavier than usual. There were no calls coming in, no headlights in the distance, nothing but the steady hum of my engine and the sound of waves breaking far below the cliffs. That was when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind carrying noise from the water, but it was too steady for that. It sounded like a low mechanical groan, followed by a pause, then the same sound again, not loud, not aggressive, just present. I slowed the car and rolled down the window, listening carefully. The sound wasn't coming from the sea, it was coming from farther down the coast, in the direction of the lighthouse. I reminded myself of the rule. I stayed where I was. The radio crackled softly, not with a call but with interference, a low static pulse that came and went in rhythm with the sound I was hearing. I adjusted the dial, thinking it was a signal issue, but the static didn't stop. It almost felt intentional, like something was testing the line without fully using it. Then, mixed in with the static, I heard something else. Not words, not yet. Just breathing. Slow, controlled. Close enough that it made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. I spoke into the radio, asking if anyone else was experiencing interference. No response. I tried again. Still nothing. The static faded, the breathing stopped, and the shoreline went quiet again, as if nothing had happened. I stayed parked for another 10 minutes, watching the darkness, telling myself there was a logical explanation. Old equipment, atmospheric conditions, fatigue. But logic felt thin out there, fragile. When I finally drove back toward town, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Faint footprints in the sand near the road's edge, bare feet, leading away from the water, leading inland, leading in the opposite direction of the lighthouse. I didn't follow them. The next morning I checked the logs. No reports from other units, no recorded radio interference, nothing about sounds, breathing, or unusual activity along the coast. Officially, the night had been quiet. Unofficially, the senior officer called me into his office and asked one simple question. Did you hear it too? He didn't wait for an answer. He just nodded, like he already knew. Before I left, he added one more instruction to the rule, something that hadn't been necessary before. If you hear sounds coming from the shore after dark, you do not investigate, and you do not listen long enough to understand them. After the night I heard the sounds from the shore, I stopped telling myself the lighthouse was simply a structure we avoided for safety reasons. Whatever explanation I had been holding on to no longer fit. Rules don't grow stricter unless something keeps pushing against them, and I could feel that pressure building. The town hadn't changed its routines, but the silence between people had become heavier, more deliberate, like everyone was trying not to remind something that they were still here. 2 nights later, I was on desk duty when the coastal camera feed briefly flickered. It wasn't unusual for the system to glitch, especially with the salt air, but this time the screen didn't just cut out. It froze on a single frame, the lighthouse, dark as it should have been. Then, for less than a second, a faint shape appeared in one of the upper windows. Not a clear figure, just movement, enough to notice, enough to make my chest tighten. I rewound the footage. The frame was gone. I checked the timestamp. It was well past midnight. According to the rules, no one should have been inside. According to every record we had, no one had been inside for years. The lighthouse was officially unmanned, its function automated long ago. Still, I logged the incident and informed my senior officer. He didn't look surprised. He just asked me if the movement looked human. I told him I wasn't sure. That answer seemed to satisfy him. Later that night, another officer called in from the inland road. He said he could see the lighthouse beam briefly turn. On and off, not sweeping the water, just flashing once, like a signal. He didn't ask what it meant. He just wanted to know if he should keep driving. I told him yes. After the call ended, I pulled out the oldest records we had access to, files that weren't digitized, stacked in boxes that rarely got opened. Reports from decades ago. Handwritten notes. Brief incident summaries with no conclusions. What stood out wasn't what they said, but what they avoided saying. Entries would stop mid-sentence. Names would appear once and never again. Some reports ended with simple instructions instead of outcomes. Do not return after dark. Structure secured. No further contact. One file caught my attention. It mentioned maintenance work scheduled years earlier, canceled without explanation. The reason listed was a single line, movement observed when facility was believed empty. No follow-up, no signature. That was when I realized something important. The rule wasn't there to keep us from finding something new. It was there to keep us from interfering with something ongoing. Near the end of my shift, the radio came alive again, briefly. No call sign, no voice, just a steady clicking sound, slow and rhythmic, matching the rotation speed of the lighthouse beam. It lasted for 5 seconds, then stopped. I didn't respond. By morning, the coastal fog rolled in thick enough to hide the lighthouse completely. From the road, it looked like it had disappeared. Locals said that was normal, seasonal, nothing to worry about. But the fog stayed longer than usual, and when it finally lifted, the lighthouse was still there, dark, silent, waiting. That day, a new line was added to the rule set, circulated quietly among officers only. If movement is observed inside the lighthouse after dark, it is not to be confirmed, recorded, or discussed after the new rule was quietly circulate. I stopped pretending that what we were dealing with could be understood through normal procedures. The instructions weren't meant to guide investigations anymore. They were meant to limit awareness. That realization stayed with me longer than I liked, especially when I started noticing small inconsistencies in our records. Nothing obvious, just details that didn't line up if you looked too closely. During a slow afternoon shift, I requested access to archived property records related to the lighthouse. Not incident reports, those were already restricted, but land ownership files, zoning permits, and infrastructure documents. On paper, the lighthouse existed. It had a location, a construction date, and a maintenance history that ended abruptly decades ago. But when I cross-referenced those records with coastal maps and emergency response zones, the coordinates didn't match. The lighthouse appeared slightly out of place, like it had been logged from memory rather than measurement. I brought this up to a clerk who'd worked there longer than anyone else. She glanced at the file, then quietly slid it back across the desk. She didn't tell me to stop. She just said that some structures along the coast had been adjusted over time, and that it was better not to question which version was correct. When I asked what she meant, she changed the subject. That night, I went back on patrol, sticking carefully to the approved routes. The fog had returned, thicker than before, rolling in from the water and settling low along the road. Visibility dropped fast. My headlights barely cut through it, and the ocean itself was completely hidden. Somewhere beyond that fog, the lighthouse stood. At least it should have. The radio stayed quiet until just after midnight. No static, no interference. Just a single transmission that didn't follow protocol. No call sign, no identifier. Just my name, spoken clearly, like the speaker was standing right beside me. I didn't respond. The voice didn't repeat itself. Instead, the radio clicked off on its own, leaving the car filled with silence. I kept driving, eyes forward, reminding myself of every rule I'd been given. Do not engage, do not acknowledge, do not confirm. As I passed the stretch of road closest to the lighthouse, something caught my attention through the fog, a shape, tall and narrow, Not the structure itself, but something standing near where it should have been. It didn't move. It didn't approach. It just stayed there, partially obscured, as if it didn't need to be seen clearly to be noticed. I didn't slow down. Back at the station, I logged the patrol as uneventful. That was the expected procedure. But when I reviewed the automated GPS log later, I noticed a gap, a span of several minutes where my vehicle's position hadn't been recorded at all. The system hadn't failed. Everything else that night had been tracked perfectly, just not that stretch of road. The next morning, a senior officer stopped me before I left. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer explanations. He simply told me that the older records were inconsistent for a reason, and that trying to reconcile them only made things worse. The lighthouse doesn't stay in one place, he said quietly. And it never has. After that conversation, one final note was added to the internal guidelines, written plainly, without emphasis or detail. If official records conflict, trust the rule, not the map. After the senior officer told me the lighthouse didn't stay in one place, I stopped looking for physical explanations altogether. That statement alone explained too many things I had been trying to force into logic. The mismatched coordinates, the missing GPS data, the way the structure sometimes seemed closer or farther depending on the night. The rule was never about keeping officers away from danger in the usual sense. It was about maintaining distance from something that didn't behave like a fixed location. I began paying closer attention to patterns instead of events. Not what happened, but when it happened. The reports that mentioned the lighthouse, the interference, the sounds from the shore, all of them followed the same timing, always after midnight, always during low visibility, fog, heavy clouds, no moon. It wasn't random. Whatever was happening required specific conditions, and those conditions were becoming more frequent. One evening, a retired officer came into the station to drop off paperwork. He'd worked the coast decades ago, back when the lighthouse was still officially staffed. I didn't ask him directly about it. I didn't need to. He noticed the file on my desk and said, without looking at me, that the rule used to be simpler. Back then, they were told not to go inside after dark. That was it. I asked what changed. He said they learned that staying outside wasn't enough. According to him, the lighthouse had never guided ships the way people thought it did. It wasn't built to warn things away from the coast. It was built to mark something, a point, a boundary, not for sailors, but for whatever moved through the area when the conditions were right. The light wasn't a signal to the sea. It was a signal to something else, something that didn't need directions but responded to acknowledgement. When the lighthouse was automated, they thought the problem was solved. No keepers, no interaction, just a machine doing its job. But machines don't ignore things the way people can. They don't look away. They don't pretend not to notice. And over time, the light began to behave differently, less consistent, less predictable. That was when the rule changed again. No patrols, no response, no contact, complete avoidance. That night, during my patrol, the fog returned without warning. It rolled in fast, thick enough to erase the horizon. The radio stayed silent, but I could feel the pressure building, the same way it had before every incident. As I approached the boundary where the road curved away from the coast, the lighthouse beam flickered once through the fog. Not bright, not sweeping, just enough to be seen. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. But as I passed, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Not breathing, not mechanical noise. Footsteps, slow, measured, keeping pace with my vehicle from somewhere just beyond the fog. They stopped the moment I reached the turn. The next morning, the lighthouse was dark again. No reports, no missing persons, no visible damage. Officially, nothing had happened. But the rule was updated one last time, distributed quietly and without explanation. If the lighthouse acknowledges you, leave immediately. Do not wait to understand why. After the rule was updated for the last time, no one talked about the lighthouse anymore. Not openly, not even in quiet side conversations. It wasn't fear that stopped the discussion. It was certainty. Everyone understood that the rules had reached their final form, and there was nothing left to refine. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. Weeks passed without incident. No strange calls, no radio interference, no movement in the fog. The lighthouse stayed dark every night, and the town slowly relaxed, as much as it ever did. I began to think that whatever cycle we'd interrupted had settled again, that distance and silence had done their job. Then, one night, while finishing paperwork near the end of my shift, I noticed something odd in the coastal monitoring logs. The system showed a brief spike in power consumption near the lighthouse. Not enough to trigger an alert, just enough to be recorded. It happened for less than 10 seconds, shortly after midnight. There was no corresponding camera feed, no radio signal, no report. According to the rules, I wasn't supposed to investigate, document, or follow up on anything like that, and I didn't. I closed the log and prepared to leave. That's when the station lights flickered. Not a full blackout, just a momentary dip, long enough to notice, long enough to feel intentional. As I stepped outside, the air felt different, heavy, still, the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. I looked toward the coast without meaning to, even though it was miles away. I couldn't see the lighthouse from there. I shouldn't have been able to see anything. But I knew. I drove home along the inland route, staying well within approved zones, following every rule exactly as written. Halfway through the drive, my radio turned on by itself. No static, no breathing. Just a single sentence, spoken calmly, clearly, in my own voice. You've been very careful. I didn't respond. I didn't slow down. I didn't even reach for the radio. The transmission ended on its own. The next morning, I reported the incident the only way we were allowed to. I logged nothing. I said nothing. I followed procedure. Later that day, the senior officer called me into his office. He didn't what I heard. He didn't need to. He just told me that I was being transferred inland, effective immediately. No ceremony, no explanation, just a quiet reassignment away from the coast. Before I left, he gave me one final instruction. Don't come back here after dark, he said. Even as a civilian, I no longer work in a coastal area. I don't patrol near the sea. I don't see fog roll in from the water, and I don't hear waves breaking against the rocks at night. Officially, my time there ended without incident, but the rule still exists. It's passed down quietly to new officers. It's followed without question. And it hasn't changed, because it doesn't need to. So if you ever find yourself near a coastal town where the lighthouse goes dark after sunset, and no one can quite explain why, remember this. Some warnings aren't meant to protect you from danger. They're meant to keep you from being noticed. And once something notices you, distance is the only thing that still works.